Newsmakers is very pleased to welcome this week the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, Senator Carl Levin of Michigan. Our two questioners are Rick Mays, congressional editor for the Army Times, and Roxana Tiran, who is a defense correspondent reporter for The Hill. Thanks to both of you. Rick, let's start with you.
Senator, it seems inevitable at this point that there's going to be a troop buildup in Afghanistan, and it's going to include one element that you've been after, a big increase in trainers, and it's going to include probably some security forces, too, to try to protect the country. Can you tell me a little bit about how much numbers you personally expect the increase will be?
I don't have a prediction or an expectation. I have a position as to what I think should happen, but I have no way of knowing what the decision is. There's been rumors to various effects, but there's been rumors all along here, number one. And number two, the focus of the media, it seems to me, has just been exclusively on a troop number, whereas the issue is much broader than that. So there's going to be many elements, I'm sure, in this decision. Number one, it may include a troop number, but that number then would include, if there is a troop increase, would include trainers, I assume, people who are enablers, people who are involved in logistics, if there's going to be troop increases. And so a key part of the troop increase question is what number of combat troops, if any, would be involved. And then on top of all of that, you've got the other aspects of a policy in Afghanistan. Of course, strategy coming first as to whether we're basically going to have a counterinsurgency or counterterrorism strategy. I think that decision has been made some time ago, and I think correctly. But there's also, on top of that, all the other elements of a strategy. For instance, how are we going to show the resolve that is important to success in Afghanistan, not just with additional combat troops, if any, but with the trainers for Army and police, with the equipment issue. The equipment going to Afghanistan to the Army in Afghanistan is critically important. There's not been a major thrust for that equipment so far. We need to see that, I believe, so that we can see a transition from our being there in large numbers to the Afghans taking responsibility for their own security. And on top of all those factors, you got the question of whether you're going to have an Afghan government there that's going to take on corruption, and whether or not they're going to start delivering services in a much better way, and whether they're going to have a plan to reintegrate the Taliban, particularly those lower-level local Taliban, back into Afghan society the way it was successfully done in Iraq. And that is a package, and I would hope that whatever that package contains, that it would be a NATO-Afghan initiative, and it not just be a U.S. decision, and surely not limited to the question which the media has been focusing on, which is the question of troops, but be a comprehensive NATO-Afghan initiative.
Senator, you said several times if there was a troop increase. Is there any possibility you see at this point that there would not be a troop increase coming out of the White House?
I just don't know what's going to come out of the White House. I, of course, have argued for holding off any combat troop increase while these other factors are focused on, so that we can see a transition to Afghan control of their own fate. The Afghan army has got to grow a lot faster. It has not been growing fast at all recently. There's got to be a much better effort on equipment and so forth. So I just don't know what, if any, what number of additional combat troops, if any, would be coming. And if so, what would be American and what would be other NATO countries? It's something I just do not know. Can't predict with any confidence. What I only can do is say what I have been urging upon this administration, which is to both Afghanize and NATOize this effort.
And Senator, could you sort of indicate to us at what point you think the Afghani security forces can take over, and how much longer do you foresee the U.S. military actually staying in Afghanistan in large numbers?
Well, they are capable of taking over now to the extent they have the forces now in Afghanistan. They got more troops than we do, and a majority of their units are able to both take the lead with us and indeed act independently without us, so that they are able, to the extent that they have the numbers in the Afghan army, to take control in a certain number of areas right now. And as they grow in numbers, they'll be able to take control both independently and with our support in more and more areas. So it's kind of hard for me to say what number of square miles or how many cities they'd be able right now to take control over effectively, but there's a significant number that they can do now. They're partnering with us in many, many areas, but not enough. When I was in Helmand Province a few months ago, the ratio of American Marines to Afghan soldiers was 5 Marines for every Afghan soldier. Well, that is not acceptable. It ought to be reversed, if anything. We want to have a training, mentoring, partnering program with the Afghans, but it's got to be a much larger number of Afghan soldiers for each of our Marines or soldiers that is in that partnership relationship.
What would you describe it sort of in some short terms as a success in Afghanistan? At what point do you think the mission will be successful?
When the Afghans are able to secure most of their population, and when they from the Taliban, and when they have a government which is a lot less corrupt and a lot cleaner than the current one in terms of its activities, and a government which is able to deliver services to the Afghan people.
Senator, in your opening comments, you several times referenced the NATO, combined NATO force. I'm wondering, considering the pressures that some of our NATO allies are feeling at home, what your message to them would be about the level of commitment they should put to this effort?
Well, I thought the Prime Minister of England came out with a very sound, solid speech on this subject a couple of weeks ago that I call the British model, because it's the one I think we ought to follow. And his model was the transition to Afghan control, and he went through all of the ways in which we could show resolve during this transition period, and support and partnership during a transition period. He talked about trainers, focusing on numbers of trainers, that the British were going to increase numbers. They're going to build a training facility. He talked about additional unmanned aerial vehicles, more flying time for them, newer and better helicopters in larger numbers coming from Britain. He talked about having a plan for the reintegration of the Taliban. He talked about a larger economic commitment from Great Britain, but that would be conditional upon a plan to reduce corruption in the Afghan government. And he talked about this all being contingent upon NATO and the international community also supporting and coming through with additional kinds of support and commitments on the part of the international community. And then he said, at the end of that, and we would also increase the number of troops. As one of a large number of factors, we would increase the number of troops, conditional upon all those other things happening, from 9,000 to 9,500. Well, that's about a